This is Steve Morris with this presentation on why you need a legal entity. Disclaimer first, of course, this is not legal advice. This is educational material. You, of course, need to work with an attorney to figure out how to properly set up your company. Now, why do you need to create a legal entity? Well, there are a lot of reasons. First of all, it's a repository, a place to own your intellectual property. It allows for founder ownership. As soon as you create the entity, it brings up the question, who owns what? That's a very good question to deal with right up front. It's a place to put funds and services. It's a focal point for the team's collective effort. It has the ability to form binding contracts as a legal entity. That's certainly valuable. And it can even provide a certain amount of liability protection for the shareholders. So lots of good reasons to create a legal entity. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that first one, the repository for IP. This is a really important one. Your company needs to own its intellectual property, which means founders, employees, and contractors need to assign their intellectual property to the company. That includes contracts and inventions, just to name a couple of things. You need to do this right up at the beginning. Assigning IP to the company for founders is typically part of the same discussion of how much of the company do you own, because you're getting part of the company in part in return for the intellectual property that you're going to assign to it. So these two topics tend to be kind of bound together. Deal with both of them up front. Don't put them off until later. This just gets harder to figure out. It doesn't get easier. So assign the IP at the front, up front in your company's history, and figure out ownership up front. So when to create the legal entity? Well, that means earlier is better than later for all the reasons we just talked about. That, of course, brings up the question, well, what type of legal entity? Certainly, you need to talk to an attorney. There are various choices, but remember, you can always change down the line if you decide you chose the wrong one. The most important thing is to get it done. Typical choices, well, there's the limited liability company, very flexible, easy to set up, but there's less case law behind it. It's a newer concept compared to a corporation. You could set up an S Corp, which is simply a corporation that makes an S election to the IRS. It does have some ownership restrictions, so you'll need to talk to an attorney about that. Now, both the LLC and the S Corp are pass-through entities. In other words, they don't fill out a tax return. The profit or loss passes through to the shareholders. They report the income or loss on their taxes. That's actually one reason why a lot of investors don't like those two forms. The good old-fashioned C corporation is typically what investors prefer. Even though that can get into a double taxation situation, it's still what they prefer. Of course, one other option is the B corporation. The C corporation typically is really focused on shareholder value as its main goal. A B corp consciously is saying, we care about shareholder value, but we also care about benefit to the society, and we'll take both of those into account in making big decisions. So, which one is the right one for you? It's a great discussion to have with an emerging business attorney. Make that decision and get your entity set up. Now, the other question that comes up is, well, what about which state? Should we do it in our current state or in Delaware? Well, some investors do require Delaware, but you're going to pay higher fees and taxes because you'll probably have to pay a foreign corporation fee in your current state, as well as Delaware fees. You'll have to pay income taxes in your current state. So, talk to your attorney. It's not that hard to set up a corporation in your current state, and if you have to, you can always change it. You can always make a change down the road. I think the most important thing is just get it done, get a legal entity set up one way or another. How much does it cost? I'll give you an example. In Oregon, it costs $100 to go down to Salem and create either a corporation or an LLC. Now, if you do what I'd recommend, you'd work with an emerging business attorney to set the corporation up in a way that's sort of investor ready. That'll cost you anywhere from $1,500 to $15,000, rough numbers. And that's why it's a good idea to shop around. Some firms will look at this as sort of a loss leader and just charge at the lower end. And that always seemed pretty reasonable to me because it's pretty much standard boilerplate. Other attorneys will argue, no, it's not standard. We invest a lot of time and expense in keeping all this up to date, and so we want to charge you more for it, but maybe we won't invoice you until later when there's some kind of a significant financing event. So you don't have to come up with cash up front. Again, different firms have different models. Shop around, talk to them, get some referrals, get some testimonials, and choose the attorney that you think is the best fit for your company. But again, bottom line, choose an attorney, talk to them, get your legal entity set up sooner than later, so amongst other things, you can get your IP assigned and make sure that you really are protecting that IP ownership. And those are just a few of the things that you should be thinking about and talking to an attorney about, and a few reasons why you really do need to set up a legal entity.